question mark about the judgment about how far you are with any particular bar line, any particular activity. And the first question I always ask is, are you measuring what you've done or what you've got left to do? Because they are different things. Operations go slowly at the start, maybe, or go slowly at the finish. There may be problems with what's to come that you haven't yet tackled. So optimism bias tends to creep in, and it's amazingly how far they mark themselves along those bar lines until they get within about 3 weeks of the end of them, and then strangely it doesn't move anymore. And then, of course, if you then you start counting and actually measuring what you've done rather than taking a view, you start reporting that by graphical means. Typically, if you're using the Acumine system, it's most likely to be, a plan versus actual graph showing how many areas, how many meters of floor you should have done, or how many columns you should have put up, or how many light fittings you should have installed, or whatever. So then you start to see a trend, and people respond much more readily to seeing a couple of lines on a graph and seeing them diverging or converging. It's very hard to argue that if over a period of time your planned and your actual diverge by 10% a week, it's very hard to argue that doing the same thing tomorrow is going to solve the problem. It's an industry in which a lot of people think they just know. I've got a lot of experience. I've built a lot of jobs. I can sniff the progress. I can go out there. So there's a bit of that. So I think that's one of the problems. I think, to be fair, the systems software and computer systems weren't particularly available up to about 20 years ago. Things like Power BI, for instance, have transformed the way we do this stuff, and the ability to house large amounts of data and so on and so forth and visualize it. If I go back to when I started in the 90s on the PFI projects, hospitals and prisons, you did it in Excel, and then you produced a pivot table, and it was all very manual. And the problem with that was it worked fine at a site level, but you couldn't share that up through the organization. You couldn't aggregate a dozen projects using that type of reporting into one summary report or anything like that, except by doing it manually. So I think the availability of systems and software and computer power has made a big difference. That's probably been the enabler. But I think fundamentally there's been a lack of recognition of the importance of it. What drove me in the early days was the damages, the risks associated with doing PFI work. We were carrying enormous damages for late completion on those projects, disproportionate really to the profit in the projects or the size of the projects. So you needed a capability to be at least on top of the progress side of things. So that was the driver for me. It was how do we manage these big projects? How do we mitigate risk? And I remember walking down, the corridor of our hospital we were building in South London, and all the way down the corridor walls were graphs showing production of all the key trades, and that was the first time I'd seen that done. And that was an enlightened project manager and an enlightened business, all trying to mitigate their risk. So I think risk has definitely been a driver. I think the amount of construction failures we've probably seen in the last 10, 15 years has probably woken people up a little bit to it as well. We do see a lot of failures now, but mostly I think the primary blocker was recognition of the value and its ability to mitigate risk, and lack of capability of systems. I think both those things have changed in the last 5 or 10 years. But that raises us an interesting point, which is, reporting needs to be holistic wherever possible. We've spoken a lot about progress and program because that's at the heart of construction, and indeed is often the root cause for financial problems on jobs. But for me, the real value is when you can look at your commercial information, like your procurement progress and your procurement issues, buying to budget or not, and so on and so forth. You can look at your cash flows, you can look at your expenditure on preliminaries, i.e. your staff and your overheads on site, and you can look at your productivity as well as just progress, kind of related but not the same thing, and we tend to confuse them. If you can look at all those things holistically in the report, with the same sort of concept of looking at trends, looking at things graphically, then you start to get a real story and you start to get the real picture. And I find that's a great way to do a project review. You know, just work your way through the dashboard. If it's an holistic, complete dashboard, just work your way through the dashboard. And it's really interesting to see the conversations that it stimulates and the challenge that gets thrown up. Even by the people who are on the site and delivering it, that sitting down, looking at the whole picture, looking at what the trends are telling them, normally leads to a really good conversation and ownership then of both the problems and the solutions, rather than just being told.